Thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon and moving to Zoom with us. We really appreciate it. I wanted to say thank you also to Mark Novak, who is Fire Chief of Vail Fire and Emergency Services, and also to Paul Cada, who's on here today. He's the Wildland Program Manager for Vail Fire and Emergency Services. And Mark and Paul are here this afternoon to explain how the proposed Fire Free 5 program would work in the Vail community, and also to answer and assist you with any questions you might have on the program. Just a quick reminder that it is a proposed program. There's an article today in the Vail Daily. I know it's online. I don't know if it's in the print edition, online at vaildaily.com. The Vail Town Council is going to take up the resolution at its meeting tomorrow at Vail Town Hall, and that'll be at 6 p.m. So with that, Paul and Mark, I am going to turn it over to you. Paul, I have you as the co-host in case anything happens, but again, thank you gentlemen for being on here this afternoon.
Great. Well, thanks, Mel, and we really do appreciate everybody's time and attention. And Mel, you for sponsoring this, and BBR for sponsoring this. So as Mel mentioned, we're proposing a new regulation in Vail, which would require a 5-foot non-combustible zone around every structure. And why that's new and different than what's maybe occurring in other communities is this applies to existing structures. There's not really a grandfathering, but there are some exemptions we'll talk about. So that's a big change, right? We haven't really had mandatory requirements for home ignition zone or wildfire hardening or defensible space in Eagle County that are mandatory, except for a new construction. But before I dive in too far into that, I really want to talk about the why. I'm a big Simon Sinek fan, and I think understanding why we're doing something is really important. And we'll start with, great, and Paul's writing the slides. He's in a different room than I am. So if we're a little clunky there, a little grace would be great. Paul, if we go to the next slide, that'd be great. So I want to talk a little bit about why we're proposing this change now.
Sorry, you want to send that or no?
And one of the things I really want to emphasize is that our community, when it was first constructed in 1963 and throughout the 70s and 80s, the high elevation Rockies really didn't have a wildfire problem. We had relatively small fires. We had low history of loss. Our fire season was relatively short, and it was somewhat manageable. So you didn't see a history of losing structures. And what I'll tell you about this slide, I won't read every one of them to you, but really since the year 2000, we've seen this rapid escalation in the size, scope, and destructiveness of wildfires in Colorado. And so basically, kind of all of our wildfire history has occurred in the last 20 to 25 years. And that's really important. We'll go to the next slide and talk about some other important factors. The other thing that's really important to note is that we're having fires that travel and spread much faster than they historically did. And so fires today are about 250% faster than they were in the year 2000. And so what that means is that we have very little time from when fires are igniting to when they're threatening community, which gives very little time for evacuation and very little time to get suppression resources in place to protect communities. And these fast fires, the ones that move especially fast, they're just about 3% of all the fires, but they're causing 88% of the damage. And so you've all seen the headlines, fires like the Marshall Fire, the Lahaina Fire, and the previous slide, really focused on big fires. But what I want to emphasize here is that you don't need a big fire to cause a lot of damage in a community. So Marshall Fire, about 6,000 acres, even by historical standards, a really small fire. You all saw the news, we lost 1,000 structures. Lahaina Fire, just over 2,000 acres, and lost 2,200 structures. So we're seeing this change where these really fast fires are getting into the community, and then we're having structure to structure fire spread that's causing this really, really large scale loss. We can go to the next slide, Paul. The other thing that's happening is we're seeing this change in where fires are occurring. And so what this slide depicts is this change where, prior to, in the 80s and even really prior to 2000, we didn't see a lot of destructive fires happening at high elevations. And today we're seeing many fires happen at high elevations. Most noticeably would be the East Troublesome Fire. And that occurred at a similar elevation as Vail. And of course, that one, it jumped the Continental Divide, it burned an alpine tundra, burned up, I think, about 400 structures. And really, even 20, 30 years ago, that kind of fire just wouldn't have occurred for a large number of variables, but really having to do with the length of our high fire season, snow coming later, these high wind events that cause these fast fires. And so this all comes together to where we're seeing the greatest relative increase in acres burned at elevations above 8,000 feet. Again, the point that I'll make that I already made, but I want to be repetitive on this, is what we did in our communities and communities like Vail in 1960, the way we vegetated them and the way we built our homes, was completely appropriate for the fire environment in 1960, 1970, 1980, 1990. And many of those things that we did back then are completely inappropriate today if we don't want to lose a lot of structures. And I think that's important because we hear from a lot of people said, hey, my home's 30 years old, and 30 years ago, maybe the design review board or some other entity required me to plant this vegetation. And they did that because we were living in a different era of fire. Next slide, Paul. And so this picture, the chimney in the background is a little misleading, but I think it's important to show because this is a fire in Lahaina, or the fire in Lahaina. And why I show this picture is that people often think that, well, it's just regular homes that are at risk from fire. And we've seen now really increasingly over the last 20 years, commercial structures, multifamily dwellings, those types of buildings are just as susceptible to burning in a wildfire. So we need to pay attention to that. And it really isn't the focus of this presentation, but I think it is important to know, you all especially know how stressed we are in our community, in our county with housing issues. And just, try to think about the loss of 100 units of housing and how that would impact our community. We would lose a ton of workforce. There would be nowhere to house the workforce necessary to rebuild. It would have implications on building costs. We've seen that in other large fires. So again, this isn't just a problem with single family dwellings. It's a problem with all structures. And again, wildfire is a housing problem. We need to kind of, not separate those because often we hear, well, the cost of living is already so expensive. We can't do anything that increases costs because that's going to make housing even more challenging. And I stand pretty strongly on we can't afford to lose a single structure in Eagle County because that's going to exacerbate the housing problem. Next slide, Paul. So the next two slides gonna throw up some kind of headlines from various papers and various media sources. Not going to read them all, but really the point of these is that wildfire is also having major implications on insurance markets. And maybe some of you have seen this when you're trying to close on properties and they're having trouble getting insurance. And we're seeing this scenario where whole areas are becoming uninsurable. We're seeing a lot of non-renewals, even in Eagle County, especially in the multifamily market. And talking to some of your colleagues, I've heard of situations where you have a deal, it's all put together, and then the new buyer can't get insurance. Next slide, Paul. So there's kind of this cascade of wildfires occur. The insurance companies start changing the way they're looking at wildfire. And then that starts impacting housing costs or the ability to close on properties. And then that can have also impacts later down the road on property tax revenue, muni bonds, things of that nature. The other thing that's important about kind of insurability, sorry, let's go to the next slide, Paul. I got ahead of myself there. So we have this cascade of wildfire causing more costly or unavailable insurance. We've all heard about underinsurance of homes. You guys all understand, our market's a little different because we have a few more cash buyers than in other markets, but that impacts the entire real estate market. So what we need to do is we need to reduce community risk. And there are some things that are in play to address insurability, but they're not the full solution if we don't address the root cause, which is keeping homes from burning. And so we'll go to the next slide there. So a lot of times when I talk with folks about insurance and kind of by disclosure, I sit on the Colorado Fire Commission and I co-chair the insurance committee of the Colorado Fire Commission, and I co-chair it with a member of the insurance industry. But part of the reason insurance companies are pulling out or they're non-renewing is that it's become unprofitable to insure. And because of that, they're not looking at insurance the way they historically have. Historically, they said, okay, let's look at zip code 81657 Vail, and what's the history of structure loss due to wildfire? And they look and they say, hey, there's little or no loss or history of structure loss due to wildfire in Vail. Now what they're doing is they're using prospective models that look forward, using new fuel models, new climate models, and what's the risk of having a catastrophic loss, not where we lose one home or 10 homes, but what's the risk of losing 100 homes? And they're applying those models to the insurance markets. And so you take that combined with the slide you're seeing in front of you, and what this is showing is in a 10-year interval from 2013 to 2023, insurance companies as a whole in Colorado lost money 7 out of those 10 years. And that's what's causing them to change what they're doing as far as providing insurance and non-renewing. So we'll go to the next slide, Paul. This is also showing, I'm sure this isn't news to any of you, but Colorado has very high insurance premiums, some of the highest in the country. And I think that's important to point out. There's two things that point out here. One is you'll notice the eastern half of the state is very dark red. And want to acknowledge that the insurance problem in Colorado isn't just wildfire, severe convective storm, which typically is hail in Colorado, but can also be tornadoes, is one of the major drivers of loss. But it's a little interesting when you look at Colorado as such deep red, and then you look at California and it's red, but not as red. And we'll go to the next slide and that'll explain that a little bit. And we go back a couple years and you look at Colorado, and don't have an updated slide for last year, but Colorado has a much lower non-renewal rate than a state like California. And why that's important is that in Colorado today, insurers are able to properly price risk. And so they're staying in the market to a much greater degree than they are in a state like California, where legislative action has made the insurers unable to properly price risk. So their answer is just to pull out. And I bring that up because we don't want to be California, obviously for a lot of reasons, but for that insurance reason as well. So when your insurance premiums come in and they're really high, I say this a little tongue in cheek, you should actually be happy because it means that the insurance companies are properly pricing risk and they're more likely to stay than in a state like Colorado. We'll go next slide, please, Paul. So there is some relief available. I'm not sure if you guys have heard about the FAIR plan, but the FAIR plan is kind of insurance of last resort or emergency insurance. And it went into effect this year. And basically, if you've had 3 non-renewals, you can apply and you can get coverage under the FAIR plan. What's important to note about the FAIR plan is that it's relatively expensive. It has relatively limited coverage for a lot of other things. A lot of the niceties that you have in a normal insurance policy, like loss of use, don't exist under the FAIR plan insurance. But what's really important, if you look at the upper left-hand blue box there, it only provides $750,000 for a single-family dwelling in coverage. And most of you will know that there's not a whole lot of single-family dwellings you could rebuild in Eagle County for $750,000. And then for a multifamily, it provides up to $5 million in coverage. Again, probably not enough to rebuild most commercial or multifamily dwellings in our county. There's some other things that are in play. Next year, House Bill 1182 will go in effect. And that basically is going to require some insurers, and it's fairly complicated, to acknowledge mitigation that is done at the parcel level and provide discounts. There's a little bit of a concern that that could drive some insurers out of the state. But the mitigations that the insurance companies that stay in the state are very much that they will acknowledge and provide discounts or stabilized premiums are very much in line with what we're proposing to require under the Fire Free 5. So I'm going to kick it over to Paul. Paul's going to talk a little bit more about the science of why the Fire Free 5 matters. And before I do that, I'm sorry, I got one slide ahead. So sorry about that. So a couple of things I want to leave you with is that, this is a difficult problem. Fire suppression isn't the solution. Often I hear, well, we have a good fire department. We don't need to worry about wildfire destroying homes. You look at a place like LA, a couple hundred fire engines on duty every day, and they couldn't stop the losses that you saw in Palisades and in Altadena. We can't simply just price our way out of the WUI problem. If we did that, insurance would be unaffordable for everybody. So we're going to need to take individual action at the parcel level to make our community more resilient. And then lastly, we haven't yet demonstrated the willingness to regulate our way out of the WUI problem. And what I'll leave you with before Paul talks about why the Fire Free 5 is so important is the fact that sorry, I'm losing myself here. I've worked in, let me back up a little bit. I've worked in a lot of communities in Southern California, Northern Nevada, and worked in wildfire mitigation programs. And the reason regulation is so important is that even with really good education, even with really good grant programs, I've never seen more than about 25 or 30% compliance in a community with wildfire mitigation requirements, such as defensible space home hardening. And so really the only way to get mitigation at scale, which is what's required to maintain insurance and what's required to protect a community, is to have a regulation. And so that's really why we're bringing this forward now. Paul's going to talk about all the efforts we've been doing for many years to get voluntary compliance with the Fire Free 5 and other requirements. And we're still, right there at maybe that 20%. And when you only have 20% mitigation, the insurance companies aren't going to recognize that. And when my house that isn't mitigated catches fire, it's going to burn down Mel's house that is mitigated because of the proximity. So that's why regulation is so important. And that's why we're at that point. And now I'm going to let Paul talk a little bit about the science.
Sorry, I lost my, I got too many screens open here. So to touch on, the next part of this, I got a short video here from the Institute for Business and Home Safety. For those that are not aware of what IBHS is, it is the Research Institute of the insurance industry. They do a lot of really good natural hazard research and have some of the most amazing tools out there. They've had a pretty heavy focus on wildfire in the natural disaster space, and I think this is a pretty good summary of a little bit of the Fire Free 5 and some home hardening. So let me know if you don't hear audio. I want to make sure that you guys can hear this one.
So from start to finish, we're going to start with our average generator.
It's a little soft, Paul.
Okay. Let me see if I can get it.
To recreate a realistic amber exposure, small burning and smoldering particles that may travel ahead of the fire front. And what we do with our generators, we create the realistic.
Make it louder.
Yep. Let me try this again.
exposure, and in our wind tunnel, we're able to throw them at a building. And then we have a building that has two sides to it, a good side, which uses wildfire resistant construction, and what we're considering a typical building that we would see in a wildfire prone area. Exactly as we expected, that mulch on the ground there caught fire from the embers. The fire from the mulch burned up under this deck, and this whole deck was on fire. And so this fire on this deck caused flames right against the home. And then if we look there at the base of the door, there was actually the flames from this deck that burned through the bottom of the door, and on the inside of the house we started to see smoke and flames. And so because this deck was a combustible material attached to the building, when the embers led to the ignition of this deck, we got flames inside of the building. Here we are on the wildfire resistant side of the house, where we had non-combustible siding, a 5-foot non-combustible zone and 6-inch gap. We had a metal gutter and multi-pane windows, and we see in comparison to the non-wildfire resistant side, this side had the same ember exposure. If you look here in the mulch, you can actually see some of the embers that had accumulated, but because they had no susceptible fuel to ignite, they just landed there and fizzled out. Now here where we have ornamental vegetation, that again is susceptible to the embers, but because it's more than 5 feet away from the home, it didn't have enough energy to ignite, and it never led to a flame impact on the building.
So you can, I'll unpack that video just a little bit. Let me back this up so we can kind of see what's going on here. What this video really demonstrates is the vulnerability of structures to embers in a wildfire situation. The vast majority of structures that are lost in wildfire aren't necessarily because the wildfire burned right up to the structure, but most often it's because of embers that are thrown outside the kind of main perimeter of the fire, which accumulates in fairly predictable locations, particularly around structures. And so by making small modifications to those specific areas, you can pretty significantly reduce the risk of fire to the structure. And I really like this video in particular because it represents a very common situation that we see here in Vail. You know, as many of you know, we have a lot of duplex properties here. And what you see here is not uncommon. You have one side of the duplex, which, you know, does really good mitigation, and they're physically attached to another side that, you know, has legacy landscaping, lack of maintenance, or, you know, some other vulnerability that's there. And, you know, kind of the heartbreaking part in my mind here is that the lack of mitigation, you know, by the one side truly does create a safety hazard for the mitigated side. And unfortunately, it really negates all of the good mitigation that happens out there. And, you know, the duplexes are the most extreme example, because they're physically connected. But, you know, another part of the emerging science that we see is that structures that are built near each other, so less than 30 feet apart, which, you know, particularly in the town of Vail is most structures. If one structure catches fire, there's enough heat and energy from that burning structure to cross that 30-foot opening, and cause the ignition of the adjacent structures. And, you know, that's something that we saw, you know, in fires like the Marshall Fire, where it really started as a wildfire and it became more an urban conflagration. It truly was a structure-to-structure type fire as opposed to what people consider a typical wildfire. So we've been out in the community a lot. A big part of our program is educating our community on you know, wildfire best practices, home hardening and defensible space. We have a curbside wildfire hazard assessment program where we assess every structure in the town of Vail at least every 5 years. And so over the last 2 years, we've been out in the community. We've done over 1,000 assessments within Vail. And what you're seeing here is kind of a result of those assessments. So of those, 1,000 structures, 88% of those structures that we assessed had at least one issue within that Fire Free 5. And you can see what's in here. I'll show you some pictures here in a minute. We have a landscaping problem here in Vail, and particularly near structures. So, what we commonly see, this is a pretty common one. I would say that that's generally a lack of maintenance, where we have, unkept vegetation right up to the structure. And you can see that's, wood siding that comes pretty much right down to the ground. That's definitely a vulnerability, especially as we get late summer and into the fall. Here's another pretty common site here within the community where people have planted over the years shrubs and other vegetation underneath this elevated deck. And really what this represents is the hazard of those shrubs act as like the catcher's mitt. They're going to catch all of those embers when they ignite that shrub. It's right up underneath the structure of that deck, and therefore it then becomes a structure fire issue. In this picture, really the big issue there is the mulch that we see. Not so much some of those perennial flowers, but the mulch is really the issue here. And then really the most common one, and you saw that in the graphic, is the trees. We have a lot of trees. We have a lot of trees that were planted 30 years ago. They were a relatively small tree that was maybe 5 feet or so from the building. Little trees grow big over time. And they definitely represent some significant hazard when it comes to embers and wildfire. So what we're proposing in this regulation would be to require 5 feet of non-combustible landscaping, and our definition for non-combustible landscaping is hardscaping of any kind, non-combustible mulch, or aka some version of rock, well-maintained and irrigated lawn, and also allowing for perennial flower beds and perennial ground cover within that first 5 feet. To help our community to visualize what this looks like, to help with good selections, a number of years ago we developed the Fire Free 5 landscaping guide, which is available on the fire department website. This really is a resource for the community. I worked with a landscape architect as well as the town's landscape architect to kind of work through incorporating a number of community values into what is really good landscaping in that first 5 feet for wildfire. One of the comments that we get very regularly is that people don't like the look of Fire Free 5. And I think a lot of that is a perception of people's view of what is or isn't required. The 4 pictures that you see on the screen there are all versions of compliant landscaping. And we have taken a large effort throughout the community to install the Fire Free 5 compliant landscaping around all Town of Vail buildings. And I certainly can point people to landscapes that I would consider quite attractive and compliant. In fact, when you're looking at this, 3 of the 4 pictures here are from Town of Vail buildings. One of the ones that I send people to frequently is Donovan Pavilion. The town spent quite a bit of effort last year in redoing the landscaping around the front of the building. I thought the architect did a really good job in designing and installing that landscape. So, you know, if you have clients or you're, you know, individually interested, you know, that's one I would definitely go look at. Some other questions that we get very regularly around the Fire Free 5 is, well, what do we do with the trees? As I showed you in that, trees are definitely the number one thing that we're concerned about. Just because a tree is within 5 feet of the building doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be removed. That's another question we get really frequently. There are really a couple ways to deal with it. You know, one option is the complete removal of a tree. And in some cases that might be the best option, but it's not the only option. Another option, which many people utilize on a regular basis, is pruning the tree so that it is away from the building. So what our guidance on that is, as the picture shows, to remove the branches from the bottom 6 feet of the tree all the way around, and then to create a 5-foot horizontal gap from the nearest branch to the building, and go up that tree until it's 10 feet over the roof of the building. So for smaller trees, that may be the entire height of the tree. For larger trees like this spruce in the picture here, you know, the pruning could be stopped at some point up the tree. You know, another question that we get from folks is, you know, isn't that gonna, you know, make the tree unhealthy? You know, besides being a wildfire specialist, I'm also a certified arborist. And you know, so the stance from the International Society of Arboriculture is that as long as you don't take more than a third of the branches on a tree, it won't affect the overall health of the tree. So some other things that we want to make sure that we're addressing within the Fire Free 5 is also about the storage of stuff within that area. So really what we're looking for is an area that's free of combustibles. So making sure that you know, besides the combustible mulch, firewood, construction materials, or other things that are stored within that area are removed. One option that people often ask is, well, I want my firewood on the deck. You know, during the wintertime, our fire danger is about as low as it gets. You know, that's a time when having firewood on the deck is okay. But you know, during the wildfire season, we don't want firewood on the deck. So, you know, two ways to address that is either to, you know, remove it during the fire season, you know, which is one option, and has some other benefits from a building maintenance perspective. Or two would be to enclose it in a way that embers can't get to it. And you know, we have definitely worked with community members over the last few years on identifying some ways to enclose firewood piles, and probably the easiest way is to get like a metal box. Some of you may be familiar with like a dock box, you know, where it's fully enclosed, has a lid that closes down. So again, the firewood can be placed inside of that, closed, and then you're really taking away the hazard with the embers. So another question that comes up regularly is, you know, how much does this cost? You know, we have the Fire Free 5 Community Assistance Program has been in place in the Town of Vail since 2022. We've funded over 100 projects on you know, all sorts of properties, and you know, through those projects, you know, we've gotten a pretty good idea of what Fire Free 5 costs. So the table there at the bottom of the slide gives kind of a breakdown, you know, of average costs. Certainly, you know, these are average costs. There are some projects that are substantially more expensive, some that are less. But you know, for a single family home, we're talking an average of $3,700. you know, the larger multifamily units certainly have a higher cost, more space. You know, really the things that are most durable. So changing to, you know, for instance, putting in rock around a building is by far the most expensive, not because the rock costs a lot of money, but because it's labor to put it there. But those are also the things that have the least amount of maintenance. You know, we work with a lot of properties that do, for instance, just pruning their trees. You know, pruning trees is substantially cheaper than, say, removing a tree. However, one of the things that we see is that properties typically have to go back and prune trees every 3 to 5 years to maintain that clearance to the building. So, you know, that's one of those when I'm working with property owners to identify what's the best solution. You know, oftentimes, you know, we're looking at how willing are they to do the, you know, ongoing maintenance versus, you know, looking for more durable solutions. So recognizing that we have lots of vegetation within a very close proximity to buildings, and also recognizing that, you know, all landscaping isn't created equal. We want to make sure that we have as much flexibility as possible. So one of the things that we're proposing in this regulation is the ability for property owners to apply for exemptions for existing vegetation that represents a minimal risk to community safety. And so what we're proposing is that people could apply for an exemption, again, for existing vegetation that's deciduous, well-maintained, it's in a healthy state, doesn't have any combustibles below it, and that it's adjacent to structures that have structure hardening stuff like non-combustible siding and not within 5 feet of openings. So really, we're identifying that vegetation that presents the lowest risk to community safety. We do have the software, the assessment program that we utilize to document all of our hazard assessments also has the ability to identify things like this individual vegetation. And so we do have the ability to note that. And I'll touch on, you know, how we're proposing to implement this here in a second. So what we're proposing and what we're presenting tomorrow to town council is to make changes to chapter 11, title 5, which is our dead tree and wildfire abatement code. What we're proposing is to adopt changes to the code this year and then use a 3-year compliance phase. So over the next 3 years, properties would have time to comply with the new regulations. During that 3-year time, we'll go out and do an assessment of every single property within the community again, and make sure that everybody has the information that they need to ensure that they can comply. And you know, this is really a extension of our outreach programs. This is not a replacement of the outreach program; it's an extension of that. And so, you know, really, we look at this as pairing this with our other programs as well, such as our curbside chipping programs, our Fire Free 5 community assistance programs, our community work days. You know, really ensuring that people have the resources to comply with this. So after those 3 years, so beginning in the summer of 2029, we'd begin enforcement of the Fire Free 5 regulations, utilizing the established abatement process that has been in place for a lot of years now. We've been utilizing that for dead tree abatement since 2007. And then because, you know, vegetation changes at a fairly regular basis, and maintenance is required, each property would be evaluated on a continuing basis at least every 3 years. so that's really the proposal that we're going to be presenting council with tomorrow. With that, that's the information that I have. But wanted to give everybody an opportunity to ask questions and provide your thoughts and feedback in this.
Betsy, I know you said you had one. If you're able to unmute yourself, go for it.
Yes, so Paul, in your in your estimate for each home, does that cost include the removal of trees? Or is that just for the new landscaping?
So that is an overall average of, so I think that was over 50 single family homes was in that group. So some of them had, tree removal, some of them had rocking, some of it was pruning. Each property has different individual costs.
For sure,
Certainly if somebody has a tree growing through their deck, and they need a crane to remove that, that's going to be substantially more expensive than, a tree that is, that can be, free felled into an open space and into the yard. So, those are just average costs, but I will tell you, there's definitely a wide spread.
No, yeah, I mean, and especially so for some of those properties in West Vail that are
Sure.
bordering. So what is the proposal in regards to those properties that are bordering West Vail that it might be backing up to BLM? Are you gonna make the homeowner remove those trees? Are you gonna make the government remove those trees?
So legally, we can't force somebody to make changes on property that they don't own. So if I would say it's not so much in the outskirts of town, but particularly around the village core, there's lots of places where the legal property line is the foundation wall. There's not 5 feet of legal ground. And, I've already been working with the landscape architects and the planning department on how to address that. But, legally, we can't force a property owner to do work on somebody else's property.
That was gonna be my other question. So if there's a lot of, so there's some high density areas, and if the tree that is not on my property, but it's on my neighbor's property, and it doesn't affect them by 5 feet, but it affects me by 5 feet, how are we handling that?
Yeah, so we deal with this right now at the Main Vail Fire Station. So, if you go by the Main Vail Fire Station, there are a bunch of spruce trees that are essentially touching the building of the fire station. The trees are actually owned by Villa Cortina. The branches touch the building. As a property owner, you legally own from the ground to the sky. And so any branch that extends across that vertical property line is your legal, you have the legal ability to prune. And so, in that situation, we take care of the pruning of the branches of Villa Cortina's trees on our building.
Okay, well, that's nice of you because you're the fire department, but when it comes to a neighbor, I don't know if that's gonna be the same. And when you were talking about, aren't there already codes in place for maintenance of properties that would address some of the things that you're already trying to solve, or no?
So there is, under our current wildfire code, so new construction, so anything built from 2018 forward is required to maintain their property, basically as it was built. So, we do have the ability for anything that was built or modified since 2018 to enforce defensible space maintenance into the future. Anything that was built previous to that does not have any requirement for that.
I'm not even talking about for defensible space. I'm just saying maintenance of property. Because
Yes.
a couple of things you showed, I mean, it's, it's people's, excuse my French, it's people's shit that's sitting
Sure.
outside their home.
Yeah. So right now, to get to the level of abatement, because the town does have an abatement ordinance in place. It has to be an imminent threat to public safety
Okay.
before the town can act on it. And so it has to be a pretty egregious act, if you will, for us to enact the current abatement regulations.
Okay. That's, I mean, that's all that I mean, we see the need for it and so forth. I just don't like for the hands of government to be able to have to make it to something to where homeowners are required to do so, especially
Sure.
since, you know, when things were first built, there was a landscape requirement for them to plant those trees. And differing, you know, of what it was. And I know we're in different times and so forth, and would prefer that, you know, you continue with the education, but
Yeah,
we'll
you know, one of the things that I didn't include in this, so you know, we've pretty much worked through the willing. You know, to Chief's point, we're about 20% into the community, and if you look at our annual usage of our existing programs, for instance, the community assistance program, it has been on a decline. This year, I'm projecting that we will not expend all the available funds within the community. So really, you know, we've done a great job in engaging with those people that are engaged. And you know, I'm not gonna lie, there's been some amazing mitigation done throughout the community. It's awesome. But unfortunately, it's a patchwork. And you know, again, like I mentioned with the, you know, with the duplexes, what really, you know, kills me is one side of the duplex will be amazing, and the other side is an absentee property owner that's not engaged for whatever the reason is. And, you know, they're physically connected. So when one side burns, the other one, I guarantee, will as well.
Paul, Cynthia Cruz, question, is there a charge for your property analysis if a homeowner requests one?
No, we do free assessments. We do lots of them. You know, so our program is, we do at least 20% of the community every year at a curbside. We also go out and do you know, assessments with property owners, you know, full walkarounds. And we are more than happy to go out for free. Usually we can get to the properties in less than a week. So we try to be very responsive, because in my opinion, that's the best way to you know, to get people engaged in that risk reduction activities.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for your time this afternoon. We appreciate it. Thanks everyone for joining on Zoom. This was recorded, so I'm going to get it up on our website. We have a videos page, and I'll also share contact information. Thank you very much, Paul and Mark, and everyone. Have a great rest of the day.